Hi, I'm Daniel Berger. Welcome back to AIM Truthcast. Today we're going to be looking at the 5 errors of psychiatric diagnoses. This is video 1 of our series on the 5 errors of psychiatric diagnoses. And before we go any further, I want to once again remind you that the phenomena that are listed, that are said to be the diagnostic category or label or diagnoses, the disorder concept, the actual phenomena are real. But the label is not helpful to us. Yes, it helps insurance companies. Yes, it helps secular researchers try to find something in the body. But it doesn't provide utility in actually helping you. It doesn't explain you, and it doesn't explain your phenomena. We saw that very clearly in the last video. So let's jump right into looking at these 5 errors of psychiatric diagnoses. I want to give these 5 up front to you so that you can consider them, and then I'm going to introduce them here. I take the time to do separate videos on each of these because it's really important that we grasp what we're accepting when we accept a contrived, a man-made psychiatric diagnoses. The 5 errors that we're going to be looking at today are, first of all, the error of reification. Second of all, the error of tautology or a tautological error. Third of all, the error of causation, or sometimes it's called causism. Fourth of all is the error of untethered deviation. And fifth of all is the error of category. And I'm going to explain these as we go. So let's begin with the error of reification. Now, reification is not difficult to understand. If I say something is real, and I only believe that things that have organic substance or have physicality, that's materialism, bioreductionism, that those things are the only things that are real, then anything that doesn't have physicality, that lacks some type of marker in nature, I've got to somehow get into the physical realm. And that's what reification is. It's a stretch. It's taking an idea, something that is theoretical, and transmuting it into being a physical thing without any evidence to do so. For example, I often use unicorns to illustrate this point. In fact, that's why I entitled my book on schizophrenia, The Schizophrenic Unicorn. Schizophrenia is a heuristic construct. It is a hypothesis about psychoses that nobody knows what is causing them. So it's literally a theory. It's a heuristic construct about things which are very real, but not in the physical sense. Psychosis is not real in the physical sense. Delusions and hallucinations do not exist physically. And so they have to be put into this construct that schizophrenia, for example, and there's many, there's a schizophrenia spectrum, there's psychosis disorders, if you would. But when they know the cause, they don't label it schizophrenia, they label it as drug-induced or substance-induced psychosis, post-stroke psychosis, postpartum psychosis, neuroencephalitis-induced psychosis, on it goes. When they don't know the cause, schizophrenia becomes a convenient category. But just like a unicorn, schizophrenia doesn't exist. The whole world knows what schizophrenia is, and people believe that it is a physical thing, and yet no one has ever seen something physical called schizophrenia. We've seen people labeled as schizophrenic because of psychosis, but psychosis, renaming it as schizophrenia, doesn't mean that it is a real thing. That would be an example of reification. Reification comes from the Latin words facere and res, literally to make a thing. They are thinking that if they speak something, that it can be brought into existence. This is the philosophy of nominalism, that if we don't have something, that we can actually curate it. We can speak it into existence out of nothing, ex nihilo. Essentially, they're playing God. You can't study psychosis in science, so let's invent a construct, schizophrenia, bipolar, etc., and say that we're doing science, and what we're going to do is actually compare people with people that are in this category, only to find out that people are not alike, that enter into psychosis and are labeled as schizophrenic. Everybody's labeled for a different reason. And so this has caused them to say that schizophrenia is heterogeneous and to admit that it doesn't exist as a real thing. If you look at the previous video, I even quoted one of the world's leading experts, Kenneth Kendler, who's openly confessed that there is no real thing called schizophrenia. Others like Sir Robin Murray have pointed out that they have rejected the whole paradigm of schizophrenia and are now just focusing on looking for real causes to psychosis, which I would advocate and encourage and agree with entirely. So reification is an attempt to make something that is theoretical exist as a real thing in nature. Just a couple weeks ago, a fascinating article was published in the British Journal of Psychiatry discussing this very issue of reification. Listen to what they say. Diagnostic categories are heuristics, not natural kinds. I just want to pause and say that heuristic simply means a hypothesis or something created in order to investigate as a possibility. In other words, they don't know how to approach what we're calling mental disorders, and so they create these heuristic constructs, these ideas, these hypotheses, to then pursue in nature to see if they can find them. However, they are not natural kinds. They are not able to be subjected to science because they don't exist in nature. So let me start over here and just read this for you again. Diagnostic categories are heuristics, not natural kinds. The hope of isolating discrete, biologically grounded disease entities has failed. That's a powerful statement. In other words, even though they invented these constructs and they said, we're going to go find these in the body, we're going to go find these in nature, it's actually failed. They're not finding any diseases. You can't create diseases. Diseases are actually discovered. That's the problem. As we looked at in the last video, neurologists look in the body to find and discover diseases, whereas psychiatrists invent heuristic constructs and then try to prove their existence in the body using statistics, using bodily measurements to try to prove and validate and make reliable their hypotheses. But this has failed. We go on in this quote, despite massive investment in psychiatric neuroscience, the gap between research findings and clinical reality remains wide. Genetically, psychiatric diagnoses often represent overlapping multidimensional spectra rather than bounded entities, although phenomenological psychopathology reminds us to respect the singular experiences that can arise with different presentations and conditions. The singular experiences that they're referring to are the individual. Every single person is different. We can't just categorize people according to like symptoms. All the people that are in a state of psychosis are being categorized into various devised categories. Some of them just simply explain the cause, but when they don't know the cause, that's when psychiatric constructs are utilized. It certainly provides utility for them, but as I pointed out in a couple videos ago, the utility or the usefulness for that person suffering and the family surrounding them has utterly failed, as this citation that we just looked at proves further. This is not a good approach to the soul. It has failed. The medical model of the soul has utterly failed, and yet they're trying to still make these constructs to be real things. Sadly, when you accept that your diagnosis is just a man-made description, or really a redescription of the description that you gave. You said, my son is hyperactive, he's all over the place, he can't pay attention, and they came back and said, well, he has attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and they reiterated what you had told them in the first place. You think that that is a real thing, that ADHD is a real thing that exists somewhere in the body, that a person possesses ADHD, or ADHD possesses them as a real material thing, as a disease entity. That is the error of reification, and it is very common. But there's another way in which reification commonly occurs. It is standard practice for a hypothesis to be suggested within the scientific method. A theory is presented, and then it's tested to see whether it's true or if it is false. And this is how the scientific method is supposed to function. Reification bypasses that entire process and essentially says the hypotheses should be treated as true, as valid, as something that is real and physical despite any empirical evidence, and we're going to go find empirical evidence to validate it, but let's accept it as true until then. That is the opposite of valid science. Valid science does not hold something as valid until it has an empirical evidence that has in fact validated it. And so when we believe that this heuristic construct that has been devised, or these heuristic constructs that have been created are real, that they exist somewhere in the body, that they explain my struggles, we have reified these constructs. Now, I want to tell you that I used this quote in the last video, but I think it's important to revisit it because it comes from Dr. Kenneth Kindler, one of the most highly regarded psychiatrists and psychiatric researchers in the world. And it was published in the Schizophrenic Research Journal. Listen to what he says. Before we pass judgment on the current diagnostic concept of schizophrenia, we need to review what kind of thing a diagnostic concept is. From the philosophy of science, we learned that hypothetical constructs, in other words, again, heuristic constructs in science, like the diagnosis of schizophrenia, can be conceived of from a realist or instrumentalist perspective. So realist would be, we don't need to reify something because it is actually real. He goes on, as the name implies, realists assume that these constructs exist out there in the world to be discovered and can therefore be judged to be either true or false. Instrumentalists take a humbler approach and suggest that such constructs should be evaluated on their utility to A, help science to advance, and B, predict things in the world. We advocate for an instrumentalist perspective on our current concepts of schizophrenia. Given our very incomplete understanding of human brain function, the historical contingency of the dementia precox schizophrenia syndrome, where would we be if Kreplin had stayed in Wundt's lab doing psychological experiments his entire career? And the variable history of most psychiatric constructs, consider monomania, hysteria, and masturbational insanity. We consider a realist view of this syndrome to be implausible. Arguing about the truth or falsificity of the current schizophrenia concept is then not useful exercise. So you can see one of the world's leading experts, and he's certainly not alone, realizes that schizophrenia is not a real thing, and yet so many people are deceived into thinking that it is real. This is the error of reification, and it commonly occurs. Here's another example in the Schizophrenia Research Journal as well from other leading experts on this construct. They state this: returning now to the issue of schizophrenia as a viable diagnosis, questions about the diagnostic validity of the uniquely human construct of schizophrenia arose with its inception and persist. Do schizophrenia diagnostic criteria reflect the manifestations of a natural disease entity associated with a schizophrenia-specific biomarker or etiological agent? No such evidence has been reported to date. Instead, a myriad of risk factors and deficits have been identified, and most of them, including genetic risk, are shared with other disorders. Thus, the current consensus appears to be that defining symptoms of schizophrenia do not coincide with a natural disease entity. We could actually go on and on from this one publication, the Schizophrenia Research, this special edition on schizophrenia from 44 of the leading experts on this construct. And the majority believe that this is not a real thing. They advocate that this is a utility. It's a box that they can ship psychosis of unknown cause around in. And yet they have no answers. And many people sadly believe that there is a physical entity, or that a physical entity will someday be discovered. They're looking for that magical unicorn. Again, that's why I chose the name I did, the schizophrenic unicorn. Dr. Nasir Gami points out in one of his podcasts that a dictionary defines unicorns, and yet they don't exist in nature. We have a universal understanding of the construct of a unicorn, and all of the elements of a unicorn do in fact exist in nature, and yet none have ever been discovered. Now, we're not going to cover reification thoroughly because I want to get through these 5 different errors. But I want to look at a couple more illustrations, how secularists realize that this is a common problem, even amongst themselves. Many physicians are not taught that these are actual medical conditions, but just hypotheses about real phenomena, about real struggles. And I emphasize that once again. Your problems are real, but the constructs do not explain nor help you to understand those or to remedy your very real struggles. And all you have to do is look around. There's so much evidence of this very thing. We need to consider what is actually real and not commit this error of reification. So let's look at this Journal of Theoretical and Philosophical Psychology. Listen to what they have to say. Psychiatric research and practices apply physical disease models and medical classifications to the realms of thoughts, feelings, and behaviors based on reification and on a superficial medical analogy where mind and mental disorders are assessed and treated the same way as bodily tissues, organs, and physical symptoms. This happens in the absence of any reflection or discussion regarding the epistemological suitability of the biomedical criteria and the concepts in its context of knowledge, nor the possibility of applying them scientifically in its praxis. Now, that's a lot of fancy words, but what I want to focus on, first of all, is that if you can access thoughts and feelings, and even the motives and intentions behind behaviors like Scripture says it can do, the Holy Spirit can certainly do, as Hebrews tells us. But if you can't do that from a human standpoint, what do you do? Well, what secularists have devised is to create these constructs and pretend like, as you see here, it's a kind of medical analogy. This invented label, bipolar, that just redescribes the description. It identifies or tells us that what we already knew, that there are two different poles that are a struggle, the depressive pole and the mania pole, but it doesn't explain anything about bipolar. There's no explanation in this. It's just a redescription of the problem, and we'll get to that error in just a second. But you also notice that it's epistemological error. It's a problem of what is true. If we're just saying that science alone can explain humanity, that's scientism. If we accept that there is spiritual and natural truths, we accept science as Christians, and we accept the Bible. That is the right epistemology to assess the soul. The Bible is the right epistemology. We can't have understanding of our deceived nature without God's truth. He is the way, the truth, and the life, and it is His truth that sets us free. And so they're realizing their epistemology has hit a wall. We can pretend like these are medical issues, but it hasn't worked. We haven't been able to create them in nature, and they are not existing as real things in nature. They're simply heuristic constructs. They're hypotheses about human struggles, very real human struggles. Distinguished psychiatric geneticist Kenneth Kindler has this to say as well about reification. Reification has many meanings, but in the context, it reflects the process whereby we have taken DSM criteria as too sacrosanct. Many of us become diagnostic literalists with respect to DSM, stymied by an excessive respect for our own creation. And let me just stop here and remind us that they openly admit that they create these constructs rather than being physical diseases that are discovered, as we've looked at in previous videos. These are created, they're fabricated, they're designed and then altered as new DSMs and ICDs come out. Continuing on with his quote, Kindler goes on to say, DSM criteria are imperfect approximations created by a very human process that, although scientifically informed, could not be claimed by any knowledgeable individual to be infallible. These criteria have been enshrined in our diagnostic algorithms and structured interviews, and are so often required by journal and grant reviewers that they approach the tokens of an orthodox faith. By losing sight of the indexable function of our diagnostic criteria and confounding the criteria with the disorders themselves, we open the door to reification. Once again, we see a very distinguished psychiatrist pointing out that essentially we're worshiping these DSM constructs that are devised by human efforts. They are human processes that have created them rather than something discovered in nature. And he's pointing out that when we think these are real, that leads to the error of reification. It is the error of reification. If you think that your psychiatric diagnosis is something real inside you, or something that someone has found, or something that explains your struggles, you have reified that construct. Moving on to Robert Kendall and Asen Jablonski, they say in the American Journal of Psychiatry, unfortunately, once a diagnostic concept such as schizophrenia or Gulf War syndrome has come into general use, it tends to become reified. That is, people too easily assume that it is an entity of some kind that can be evoked to explain the patient's symptoms and whose validity need not be questioned. Although most diagnostic concepts have not been shown to be valid in this sense, many possess high utility by virtue of the information about outcome, treatment, response, and etiology that they convey. They are therefore invaluable working concepts for clinicians. Now, why did I emphasize for clinicians? Because are people being healed of this thing that we think is real? Sometimes, some people do, many people do. They think it's a real thing. Are they being healed from this? Absolutely not. In fact, there are many, many cases, and at some point I'll do a video on this very thing. But in my book, The Schizophrenic Unicorn, I highlight that many, many times throughout history, including testimonies from some of the leading experts in the world, like Chris Palmer or Jeffrey Lieberman, they confess that there was a diagnosis of schizophrenia and then real diagnoses, many times, most of the time, actual biological things that are disrupting sleep are discovered to be the real cause. And then all of a sudden the schizophrenia label is no longer utilized. And so they're utilizing these labels when they don't know answers, and then we're calling them, we're reifying them and saying that these explain our problems. And that's what these two men point out pretty clearly here. In an article I've cited before, You Aren't in the DSM, Weishaupt goes on to say on his own, in Categories We Live By, psychologist and author Gregory L. Murphy discusses how people tend to believe that certain categories are grounded in something deep, some hidden property that gives the category its identity, even if they cannot say exactly what that something is. Psychologist Wu-King Yan and her colleagues at Yale have explored how this kind of essentialist thinking plays out in the realm of mental illness. Their studies reveal that lay people tend to see psychiatric categories as more real and more unified than clinicians do. If someone has a particular DSM diagnosis, then they imagine that there must be some internal thing responsible for the illness, something that is shared across all cases. Experienced clinicians and professionals, on the other hand, are less likely to think that way. You can easily see here that Weishaupt is pointing out that people who receive a psychiatric diagnosis believe that that is something representing a real thing that they possessed or that possesses them, something inside of them that has been discovered, but that is simply not the case. And it's kind of interesting to think about. If you recall our video on the doctrines of psychiatry, bioreductionism or materialism, naturalism is a key doctrine that underlines this whole approach to the soul. They believe that the physical nature is all that exists, so they have to reduce the soul and its inorganic phenomena down to being material, and so these constructs become convenient tools. But here's the irony. If you can't explore the inorganic nature of what it means to be human, why do you create constructs that don't exist physically? They lack physicality themselves. It's kind of an interesting perspective here. And the only thing that I can come up with is that they're deceiving people into thinking that science is being explored, that science is being done on obsessive compulsive disorder, as if it is a thing that exists in nature that science can approach, or bipolar, or schizophrenia, or ADHD. Instead, these are just constructs. They're heuristic constructs that science cannot touch. But the majority of people, as you see in this quote, believe that science is exploring, that doctors are discovering these things in the body, and it's just simply not true. That is the error of reification. And finally for today, I want to look at another quote from Medical Hypotheses, a trade journal in medicine. Tommy Bergstrom says, reification of psychiatric diagnoses is another challenge. where instead of adhering to their original purpose as consensus-based symptom descriptions to assist research and medical decision-making, psychiatric diagnoses are assumed to represent real disease entities that exist independent of the observer's conceptualizations. It is then possible that people will search for the characteristics that are aligned with pre-existing ideas on particular diagnoses, increasing the risk of self-fulfilling prophecies. So if you believe that your psychiatric diagnosis is a real thing that explains your struggles that you have, you're going to internalize that, and there's a real possibility it becomes your identity, it stigmatizes you, and it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy where you begin to live that out. You begin to act like the very things that are suggested are supposedly guiding you and causing your struggles. This is a sad, sad fruit of the era of reification. I just want to lovingly say that we must understand this truth. Psychiatric diagnoses do not explain. It is impossible for them to explain because they're not real things. They're invented so that alleged science can be done, because otherwise, how do you study people's thoughts? How do you study people's emotions and feelings in science? They don't even know where these things even begin to appear from the mind, the inorganic mind, into the physical brain, let alone how the allegedly in their theory, the brain causes these thoughts, how these feelings come about, they would say, by something in the body, some process in the body or some location in the body. It is entirely scientism that we're putting our faith in when we believe that these diagnoses are real. One very prominent psychiatrist in Europe is a pediatric psychiatrist named Sami Tamimi. Listen to what he says about this truth. Psychiatric diagnoses are constructs, ideas, not discoveries. Distress is real. Despair is real. It's exactly what we have been saying. But the labels we attach to them are human inventions, not objective truths. Over the years, these categories have expanded to capture even more shades of unhappiness and difference, and that expansion has proven extraordinarily profitable. As a child and adolescent psychiatrist, I have seen how this changes how young people view themselves. Once again, I want to stress to you that your problems are very, very real. The phenomena that they're calling symptoms of these constructs, these phenomena, your struggles, are very real. I'm in no way denying that. And that's part of the problem here. If you think that a diagnosis is real, the moment that I begin to expose that the diagnosis is not real, people think I'm attacking them and somehow saying that they're not struggling at all. Or, as I've heard some people tell me, that they've heard Christians tell them that all of this is just sin. In the future, I am going to do a video on wickedness, yes, but also weakness. A lot of what we're calling mental disorder is our human fragility. It is normal human fragility. It's not all sin. It's actually that we are weak and in need of a Savior, and it is in our weakness that we find God's grace so that His power can rest upon us. We need a Savior that can deliver us both from our wickedness and our weakness, both from our fragility and our depravity. We've only covered reification in this video, but in future videos we'll look at the other 4 errors separately. I hope you'll come back for those videos. May God bless you. Have a wonderful day.